Hi, my name is Ben Hansen, and I am an editorial assistant for the Journal of Church History. And I'm here today with Dr. Scott Kenworthy to highlight and to celebrate the publication of a church history special virtual issue, Christianity and the Orthodox Church in Russia, Ukraine, and Eastern Europe, Historical Insights for Current Religious Realities. It's a collection of 10 articles published in church history's 90-year history, handpicked by Dr. Scott Kenworthy, along with his thorough and insightful introduction. This virtual issue is available to all American Society of Church History members, either through our website, churchhistory.org, or finding your way to Cambridge Core through whatever online library resource you use. Today, we want to discuss Professor Kenworthy's selection of articles and his introduction, and discuss more broadly the history and historiography of modern or even early modern church history in Central and Eastern Europe, especially the history in the Slavic Orthodox tradition. This, of course, is in light of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the bitter and acrimonious divisions which have become more evident, especially in the Orthodox churches. But first, let me introduce Dr. Kenworthy, who is a professor of comparative religion at Miami University of Ohio. Professor Kenworthy holds a PhD from Brandeis and two MAs, one from UC Santa Barbara and the other from St. Vladimir's Seminary in New York, if that's correct. I think I've got that right. His research interests focus on the history and thought of Eastern Orthodox Christianity, particularly in modern Russia. Most recently, he has published, along with Alexander Ujanian, Understanding World Christianity, Russia, through Minneapolis's Fortress Press in 2021, a basic and long-awaited and long-needed introduction to Christianity in Russia. And he is hard at work on another book, hoping to finish it in the near future, a biography of Patriarch Tikhon that examines the story of the church in Russia at the time of the revolution. And from where I sit here in Northeast Minneapolis, I'm about 3 miles away from where Tikhon himself consecrated St. Mary's Cathedral and the first Orthodox seminary, I believe, in the United States. So it has a bit of a local connection. So welcome, Professor. Welcome, Scott. It's a pleasure to have you today and to discuss the content of this new virtual issue.
Thank you very much, Ben, and thanks for having me.
Of course. So you begin your introduction noting the rather glaring, rather embarrassing lacuna in modern Western scholarship when it comes to modern Orthodox Church history in Eastern Europe. Why does this gap exist? And do you see a two-part question? Why does this gap exist? Do you see a renaissance of scholarship in this field as something that's likely, as something that's possible? Are you optimistic or pessimistic?
Well, yeah, I mean, one of the surprising things, I guess, by contrast with the previous virtual issue, where Liz Clark had just an enormous number of articles dealing with early Christianity and the history of the of church history. There were not many articles. There was not a huge number from which to select this special edition, which says something not about church history, but about the state of the field of the history of Christianity in the English-speaking world. That Orthodoxy and Eastern Christianity is something that has really been neglected. Less so for the early period, but for beyond the medieval period for sure. And why is that? I suppose there's a lot of reasons for that. I suppose it was natural for when people started doing church history or think about what they want to study, that some kind of knowledge and connection with what you study is a kind of natural segue in that catches people's interest. And because immigration from Orthodox countries is not huge in the United States, that it was something that was really off of people's radars, and just didn't naturally gain its attention or anything like this. It also, for for those of us who are my age and older, growing up when Russia was the Soviet Union, which was the atheist state. So most of this part of the world was dominated by communism, and religion seemed non-existent. And as if it didn't exist and didn't matter in its history. It was something you just forgot about, which in and of itself is interesting, especially in light of what has happened since the collapse of communism. I think we'll revisit that later on in the interview. Um, I remember when I was a student and I took my first church history uh, survey courses. I was at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and I had wonderful teachers, Jeffrey Russell and Abraham Friesen. But as we progressed, I kind of remember having this thought, because it was just about the time that I was starting to get interested in these things myself, that Christianity, you could say, begins in the East, right, in the early centuries, but by let's say the 5th century, the way church history was written and taught even 30 years ago, it was less and less about the East, until it was more or less completely forgotten about. And then it was like, oh yeah, in 1054 there was the schism, and then literally you just never heard about it again. Um, and so that, of course, has changed a lot in recent decades with the whole kind of new interest in world Christianity. But for reasons I can't quite figure out, what world Christianity means is Christianity in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And while that's important, and that's where Christianity is growing in the world, and it's crucial that we understand that by all means, it's still, interestingly enough, for the most part, an engagement with Western forms of Christianity, Protestantism and Catholicism, as they have spread to the global South, and still just kind of bypassed Eastern Christianity as if it didn't exist or hardly matters, despite the fact that the Pew survey, whatever Pew Research Forum, listed Russia as the 4th largest country with the largest number of Christians in the world a decade or so ago. So it does matter, and it should be paid attention to. But there's problems at all level of approach. There really were almost no kind of introductory surveys that were accessible to the student or somebody. Let's say if you specialize in some other area of history of Christianity, but you want to include more about Russia or something in your class, where do you turn? There is now a body of specialized literature, but there was no kind of generally accessible things that you could kind of sink your teeth into in an easier sort of way. So that was difficult. There's no graduate programs that exist that produce people in religious studies, or in theology programs in the United States, with specialists in this area. So from kind of the most basic level all the way through the most advanced levels, the gap is kind of, you could say, almost self-perpetuating. It's not there, people don't know about it. And if you're being trained, it's usually not in something that you are trained in, even as a secondary field or something like this. So that's, I guess, maybe some of the reasons why the situation is the way it is. It has changed as far as, could there be a renaissance? There could be, and there has been for historians of Russia in particular, that since the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was like this kind of moment among church historians, or among historians of Russia, that was like, oh, religion does exist. And it always has exist. In fact, it didn't go away during all the Soviet period. And a kind of new interest and appreciation for the past, especially like Imperial Russia. And so in the 90s, there was a number of people who were being trained in Russian history, and then went on to write dissertations and books in the early 2000s mostly, and that kind of really generated a change in the field. And so talking about religious history is now understood to be important if you're a Russian historian, whereas it wasn't 30 years ago or even 20 years ago. But that hasn't happened yet in the field of the history of Christianity yet. It could, but I think it would mean some resources being put into it, especially in the kind of institutions that train future graduate students. By the way, even in the history of Russia, there's kind of a moment where, my advisor, Gregory Fries at Brandeis, and of course the great historian at Minnesota, Theo Stavru, these people are of getting close to retirement. And so where's the next generation of the scholars who will train where are the scholars who will train the next generation is a question either for Russian historians or for historians of Christianity. So that's I think it takes some will, some realization at the levels that the kind of institutions that can promote this and support it to put something behind it. That would I think the Renaissance ultimately has to come from there.
Right. Exactly. Well, it's a good exhortation, and hopefully this special issue will add something to just that sense of urgency, particularly today. And I think you've done well not only to discuss why this gap exists, but to give us some sort of hint of what scholarship is missing without a focus on particularly Russian church history and what we might gain from it. But I want to bring it forward to a question, of course, today in the news. In the special volume that you've edited, are there any particular articles in the virtual issue that you think are especially salient in light of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the conflict in Central and Eastern Europe?
Yeah. I mean, in many ways, the articles are a really broad span of talking about different types of things. So one is pretty well focused on Ukraine, the first one. Some of them are on Russia, one is on Romania, one is on the Catholic Church in Lithuania, but in the Soviet period. One is on kind of religious dissidents, let's say, in the Russian Empire and the United States among immigrants. And so there's a really broad spectrum, and some of them, they give a very rich cross section of the kinds of things one could look at. But of course, many of them not necessarily very specific to the types of questions that are being raised today. Interestingly enough, the two oldest articles from 1968 and 1969 in some ways are touch most directly on the current conflict. The very first article by Ludwig Nemetz on the Ruthenian Uniate Church in historical perspective. He does a great job of that historical perspective that gives the reader a pretty strong overview of Ukrainian church history, both Orthodox and Catholic and Greek Catholic. So that I strongly recommend, because it's a pretty hard and complex thing to get a handle on, because Ukraine has such a complicated history, beginning as the center really of this first East Slavic state, Kievan Rus, out of which both Ukraine and Russia and Belarus, the three nations, are sort of born out of that prehistory. But then after the Mongol invasion of effectively more or less what is Russia, Ukraine and Belarus are ruled over by the first Lithuania and then the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And so I have a very different history and different trajectory than Russia does. And so this sort of claim, for example, that Putin makes, that Ukraine has no history, that it was just made up by the Bolsheviks and in the 1920s, you see how this is an article like that shows you this long and complex history that Ukraine had, and that its Christian tradition, that the Kievan Christian tradition, Kievan Orthodox tradition, existed separate from and in parallel to the Russian tradition for many, many centuries, and that only in the second half of the 17th century does it sort of get incorporated into, to use a neutral word, the Russian imperial history. And then even only after that is there a gradual process by which the Ukrainian tradition is kind of Russified. The second article by Joseph Uchensky on Khomyakov, Alexei Khomyakov, who was a kind of religious and really important religious intellectual in the mid 19th century, 1830s and 40s. Such a fascinating character because he's somebody who even today is still drawn upon, but in two very different directions. So you could say church, I don't know, church liberals, if this is the right word in an Orthodox context, people who want to emphasize that church means everybody, not just the hierarchy. It means the engagement of the whole body and the sort of conciliar conception of the church as opposed to a hierarchical one. Khomyakov is the person who really gives birth to this. And yet, because of the way he contrasted orthodoxy with Western Christianity, and therefore also Russia with Western Europe, he kind of sets this basic parameter that Slavophiles draw upon, and that is still drawn upon today to kind of assert this superiority of Russia over the West and these kinds of things, which plays, still part of the kind of Putin propaganda and the Russian Orthodox perception of things. So yeah, those two articles are particularly salient, I think. Others get it all kinds of different aspects of sort of the diversity. I think that's one thing that may get lost in a conflict like this, is that all the focus, let's say, on statements by Patriarch Kirill, kind of forget about some of the other things and that are going on. Variety of ways in which this can be understood is very complex when you start looking at things on the ground.
Right, exactly. That it brings me to my next question, and you touched upon it by bringing up Patriarch Kirill, but also this sense that the church is everybody. So what little attention I think that the Western media has paid to Patriarch Kirill and his relationship with Vladimir Putin has been to emphasize their cooperation, their shared, to some degree, ideological commitments. But church historians should know, at least in my field, which is late antiquity, that the church history involves more than just patriarchs and emperors, if we're going to put it that way. So I wonder, in your opinion, academically, socially, politically, however you'd want to approach this question, how can we better understand how others who are not Kirill and who are not Vladimir Putin, I'm thinking of other bishops, priests, deacons, monastics, and lay people in both Russia and Ukraine, are thinking about this conflict? Because I've seen very little coverage outside of specific religious venues about Orthodox reactions to the war in Ukraine and Russia.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, there has been at least some more attention than usual to the religious dimension of this conflict, especially in the beginning. It's kind of such a strange moment for me, laboring away in this field that everybody seemed to think was kind of marginal and obscure. Suddenly was at the center of attention in this spring, and getting a lot more news media coverage and everything else. Unfortunately, not always the specialists that are being consulted that one would like, because they're not so many that are. Coverage has been not terrible, at least that's something good. But yeah, there's so much more to the picture than the statements of Patriarch Kirill. When it comes to understanding what's going on in Russia, this is really challenging because actually, just as in the political sphere and the religious sphere too, there is such a monopoly on voices that we actually have no idea what's going on within the churches, among believers and ordinary bishops and priests and things like this, and what their perceptions are. Literally, the only voice we're hearing is that of Patriarch Kirill, and all the other voices have effectively been silenced. Interestingly enough, Metropolitan Hilarion Alfeyev, who was kind of right-hand man of Patriarch Kirill, for, the last decade, let's say, was also very silent since Russia's invasion. And then all of a sudden, he basically lost all of his positions and was reassigned as bishop in Budapest. So it's kind of like makes you wonder what's going on, but we really don't know. There was a few priests who protested against the invasion, but then were arrested and fined and things like this. So they've done quite a job in silencing any kind of other voices. But one of the things that scholars like myself and my co-author Alexandra Agajanian have emphasized in trying for the last decade or more in trying to understand Orthodoxy in Russia today is that it's not just one thing, right? That the patriarch and the church hierarchy may support Putin, but there's all sorts of other currents going on the ground, and Russian Orthodoxy is complex, just like American Catholicism is, where you have sort of more liberal currents and more conservative currents, and some are conservative in religious ways, but not necessarily in the social ways. But you also get that as well, and a kind of rabid nationalist kind of current, but it's all going on, right? And it's incredibly complex on the ground. And Ukraine is in perhaps even more complex because there's the whole situation of splits between various Orthodox Ukrainian churches since the collapse of communism, and then the attempt in, the kind of granting of autocephaly by the Ecumenical Patriarch of Constantinople to Ukrainian Orthodox Church in 2019, which is not recognized, of course, by Moscow, and the church that is still subordinate to Moscow, well, was subordinate to Moscow, was maybe the larger church, or at least equal in size. But then that church also has kind of distanced itself from Moscow, and so the future of the Ukrainian situation is incredibly complex. And I was fortunate enough to meet some Ukrainian scholars who are in exile, unfortunately for them, but in Germany this summer, and just getting a taste of the complexities. People who had been part of the church that was subordinate to Moscow, for whom this moment of the Russian invasion was just a decisive break. That was, no more could one acknowledge Russia. That Russia, in a sense, had, Moscow, Patriarch Kirill had betrayed Orthodoxy in a way, and betrayed Ukraine by supporting this invasion. And so this, seems to promise a new possibility and future for Ukraine and its religious trajectory. But what that might be is still pretty unknown, I'd say.
Yes, indeed. And not the task of the historian who speaks about the
Right.
past. Nothing doesn't make predictions for the future. Well, I think this would probably be a good place for us to wrap up. I want to encourage our audience, of course, to get online to check out the special virtual issue, to direct your attention and perhaps your students' attentions to Scott's new Understanding World Christianity, Russia, as a good place to begin thinking historically as historians, as church historians, about the Russian church, the Ukrainian church, and a history which has been neglected too often and for too long. And I want to thank you today for your time and for your thoughtful words about this special issue that you've collected for us. And yeah, thank you very much. It's been enlightening, and I think it will prove to be very helpful.
Thank you, man. Thanks for the interview.